He's an Israel affairs analyst and the author of the book called My Israel Question. Antony, good to have you on the show. So Netanyahu had recently rejected President Isaac Herzog's compromise offer, and now he's presented a watered-down version of this judicial reform bill. What is the reasoning behind the change?
Look, Netanyahu is in a pretty difficult position. I think when he assumed power for the new time a few months ago, he was expecting a fairly smooth run. Obviously, there was opposition. There were people who didn't support his rule. But the truth is that I think he didn't expect maybe the kind of massive protests. We've seen the largest protests in Israel history in the last few months. Although I should say the vast majority of those protesters have been Jews and not Palestinians. The vast majority of Palestinians have not been participating in those protests. I think he's hoping the compromise will be accepted. At the moment, the opposition has refused that, saying it doesn't make much of a difference. And I think it's important, a little bit of context here. Like, so much of the Western media coverage around this has suggested that this is some judicial coup, that the Supreme Court in Israel is this above politics kind of body. If you're a Palestinian, you ask any Palestinian who knows about Israeli politics, they'll tell you one simple thing. The Supreme Court has been a rubber stamp, mostly, for decades for the occupation. This is not some truly independent body that is above politics. In fact, it's the opposite in the vast majority of cases. So yes, I certainly, as someone who cares deeply about what's happening in Palestine, care that the proposed changes do not go through. But let's be under no illusion that what essentially has been the reality for decades before that was hardly the sign of democracy at all. It was not.
It's an interesting point that you make. Okay, so if he's giving an ear to the people out on the street, talk to us about sort of the balance that the Prime Minister has to sort of get into in terms of listening to that side and also sort of not really stepping outside of the line of the composition of the ruling coalition and some of the positions that they have.
Well, look, the makeup, as he said, of his coalition is extreme. I mean, it's the most right-wing government in Israeli history. There are some people there who regard the proposed changes as too mild. So in some ways, he has to please them. I think he doesn't really particularly want to please the people on the streets. Many of them are on the left. They would never vote for him anyway, although there are some Netanyahu voters who have been disillusioned. Most public opinion polls, in fact, across the political spectrum say that the majority of Israeli Jews oppose the proposed changes. And also, we shouldn't forget that the US administration, the Biden administration, which has been, frankly, an uncritical friend of Israel for years, has expressed very mild, frankly too mild, displeasure with what he's proposing to do. Whether this amendment or this change will get the majority support, I'm pretty skeptical, to be honest, because I think opposition believe that A, it could go much further, and B, the hope, I think, that his government, in fact, Netanyahu's government, will collapse, which I don't think is that likely in the short term, because the truth is there are some people in his coalition, the most extreme far right, who are savouring their moment in the sun. They want to have the power that they have, not particularly about the judicial reforms, but about what's happening in the West Bank, which is, frankly, much more disturbing and has received, in my view, not enough attention in the Western media.
Let's talk about the West Bank. You earlier mentioned that if you were to ask a Palestinian about these changes, that they would not say that it's extremely radical because the Supreme Court essentially is a rubber stamp for government decisions. This disengagement law that was sort of repealed in the Knesset. I mean, it's ordering, which had ordered the evacuation of settlements from the occupied West Bank. If you're a Palestinian, I'm assuming that you would sort of analyze this in a way that it legalizes settlements in that area.
Which essentially is Israeli policy anyway. I mean, the context for this, just for viewers very briefly, is in 2005, the then Israeli government demanded and achieved a number of settlements withdrawn from the Gaza Strip and a handful from the West Bank, and it was illegal for those settlers to go back. In Gaza, those settlers are not going back because Gaza is now nominally controlled by Hamas, although in many ways it's still controlled by Israel in the skies and the borders. In the West Bank, those settlements are likely to be repopulated. And if you're a Palestinian, you would be very unsurprised by this. I mean, what I think is really missing from so much understanding here is that this is not a question in the West Bank of a handful of radical settlers. It's not a question of so-called bad apples. You have roughly 750,000 Israeli Jewish settlers living in the West Bank. They aren't all extremists, that's true, but a sizable minority are. And the people who are currently in government are friends and allies of some of those most extreme settlers, the ones who are likely to go back to those West Bank settlements are some of the most extreme. And for decades and decades, and particularly it's got worse in the last few months, and indeed even in last year, 2022, there has been a massive increase in violence. Last year, in 2022, Netanyahu was not in power. In fact, it was the time when he was out of office. It was the deadliest year for Palestinians in 20 years, roughly. So this really is a consistent uptick in violence against Palestinians and increasing. Just most recently, of course, there was a pogrom in a Palestinian village, which was clearly not just supported by the IDF, but defended by them. So this is the kind of reality that Palestinians face every day.
Okay, Antony Loewenstein, thank you very much for joining us here on the News Hour. I do appreciate hearing your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.